Okay.
So, Darcy, thank you very much for coming today to talk to us. You are very well known. I think you've been well known for a long time, actually, but outside of Korea now, as a film critic and a translator based in Korea. Can you tell us how you got here? Because you
Sure.
studied Slavic languages, right? That
Yes,
was
I did.
your major. Can you tell us the story?
Basically, I've always been interested in languages. I majored in Russian. I was at Indiana University doing my master's degree. And around that time, I decided that I wanted to live abroad. And so I got certified to teach English. And my long-term plan was to go to the Czech Republic and to teach there, because I'd studied Russian. Czech is similar to Russian, but in graduate school, I had a lot of Korean friends. And through them, I became really interested in the country. And I decided maybe before going to the Czech Republic, I'll spend 2 years in Korea, and then I'll...
The old story.
Those 2 years have become 22 now.
And you haven't unpacked the suitcase yet. So, yeah. And when was that?
I arrived in 1997.
Okay.
So actually just before the IMF crisis broke out. So
this will be your second or third crisis.
Yes.
You're going through now, yeah. And then how did you, so what did you do at the beginning? You were teaching English, or?
Yes, I was fortunate to get a teaching job at Korea University, teaching practical English to university freshmen. And actually I learned a lot about Korea in those first couple of years through them. Like my students helped me a lot. But as I was teaching sort of on the side, just as a hobby, I began watching Korean films, partly just because I was curious about, I love film and I love Asian cinema, so I wanted to know what kind of films were being made in Korea. And at that time, there was very little available. On the internet, there were no books that had been published about Korean cinema in English. And so it was really difficult to get to know it, but I had committed to studying Korean, and so
I was going to say, did you study Korean in order to connect with film in some way, or was it simply you arrived and being a linguistic student, you set about studying Korean just to get by?
Yeah, I mean, there was a time I had this dream of becoming fluent in 5 languages. Korean was going to be one of them. I've since set aside the feeling, that dream. But I began studying Korean just because I wanted to learn the language. But actually that dovetailed with my interest in cinema, because I figured that the best way to learn Korean would be to find something that I was passionate about and to use that as a motivator. And so...
Do you remember the first movie?
I mean, I'd seen 2 Korean films in Indiana before coming to Seoul. And so the first Korean film I ever saw was Sapyeonje by Im Kwon-taek, which is a classic.
93, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And to be honest, the first time I saw that film, I wasn't really quite sure what to think of it. It was my first exposure to pansori.
This is the story of a blind. No, it's the story. The woman, the pansori singer, is blind, right? And her father takes her around the country performing.
Yes, and it's her whole. She becomes blind much later, but it's the story from when she was quite young, and then there was a brother, and then there's a conflict. Some of the plot turns were quite a bit for me. Like I had a hard time really processing one thing in particular that I don't want to say because it's kind of a spoiler, but something that the father did to the daughter, ostensibly to make her a better singer. But yeah, that kind of shocked me. And so that was my first introduction into Korean cinema. I mean, since then I've seen that film many times, and I watch it completely differently now, I think, just because of, I
seem to remember that movie, doesn't it? Has, I don't know if it's the single longest shot in history, isn't it? It's like a 6-minute.
It's not the longest in history, but I think at the time it was the longest in Korean cinema. So basically it's at the beginning of the shot, we see this small family off in the distance, and they're singing as they're walking along, and very, very slowly over the course of, I think it's a 6 or 7 minute long shot, they come closer and closer to the camera. And so that's one of the most memorable shots.
So did that sort of have were you sitting there in the movie thinking, I've got to get into this, or how did you take us along the next step of the journey?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, what really struck me about Korea first was the sense I got of Korea's passion for cinema. So that, after I arrived in August of 97, and just a few weeks later, the second Busan Film Festival was held. And so I went down for the weekend to kind of see some films and experience the festival, and the mood there was incredible. Just, I think especially in the 90s, like young people in their 20s and their 30s were so interested in world cinema, and films that were kind of ignored in other countries became real, talking points in Korea, and filmmakers who would come to Korea and then present their films at the festival were kind of stunned at just the level of excitement, even for really difficult films that in the West might struggle to find an audience, that were really warmly received in Korea. And at the time, there are all these film magazines that were appearing every week. It's rare around the world. I mean, certainly now, but back then as well, to have a film weekly that could survive. And Korea had 3 of them at one time, and a number of monthlies as well. So that's what really struck me. As a fan of cinema myself, I felt like I'd come to a place where just everybody was really focused on film, and so I wanted to become a part of that.
And how did you become a part of it?
I mean, in the first year or two that I was in Korea, I saw a lot of interesting films. Christmas in August was one that really kind of captured my attention, and The Quiet Family by Kim Ji-yoon was another. And I continued to look online for information about these and couldn't find anything. And eventually I decided just to make my own website about Korean cinema, because working on websites was just kind of a hobby of mine as well. And I was certainly not an expert at that point, but I felt that something would be better than nothing. And so I put up a very simple site with some reviews. I decided to do like a newsletter, or I'd send out an email newsletter every 2-3 months. And
this is in English, right?
Yeah. And so basically I just gathered as much information as I could about new Korean films, and what films are being released in theaters and what people were talking about, and I put that up. And initially I thought that the audience for this site would be mostly people like me, expats who had come to Korea and were curious about Korean cinema just because they were living in the culture. And what surprised me was that 90-95% of the visitors and the people who emailed me were from other countries. And I didn't know it at the time, but it was just at the moment that Korean cinema was starting to kind of make itself felt internationally. And I was hearing from people in Vietnam who had somehow seen some Korean films and they were very excited about it. And that was kind of the very early stirrings of the Korean wave, I think. I was hearing from fans of Hong Kong cinema who were just beginning to realize that Korea also was turning out some really interesting films. And, people of, Korean Americans or adoptees in the US who were interested in learning more about Korea through Korean cinema. And so it was really fascinating just to be kind of running the site that ended up becoming a hub where all these different people who were interested in Korean cinema came together. And so at the time there was a discussion board that had a lot of participation around the world, and that really kind of started things rolling.
And at the time, that was a labor of love.
Yes,
Or
it still is.
You couldn't commercialize it, really.
Well, actually, what I ended up doing was, I got married in 2001. My wife is Korean. She launched a site to sell Korean DVDs. And so that ended up being kind of a partnered site with my site. Yeah. And so visitors to my site would often end up going to her site and then to order DVDs. And later, after we had kids, like we shut that down. But that was kind of the earning model for the site.
And how did you get into the translation part of it, the subtitles?
Basically, I was doing the website again as a hobby, but I ended up finding more full-time work. In 2001, I got an email from the editor of a British film trade magazine, Screen International. And they were looking for someone who could cover the Korean film industry. And there really weren't any Korean film specialists on the ground in Korea who could follow things in Korean and then write about them in English. And they had been, they'd seen my newsletter, and so they asked me to join them. And so from that point, I stopped teaching. And for the next 7 or 8 years, I was primarily working as a journalist. And in writing a lot about Korean cinema, I got to meet a lot of film companies. I got to get to know people at these sales companies who were in charge of selling Korean films overseas. And I also, just by chance, ended up getting a part-time job at the Korean Film Council, which is the it's government-supported organization in charge of film promotion in Korea. And they sometimes would recommend me to filmmakers or to film companies who were looking for someone to do, mostly proofreading at that point. My Korean was improving, but it wasn't up to the level that I could do translation on my own. But there were some very kind of memorable early experiences doing that, either working on screenplays or I was really lucky to be recommended to Bong Joon-ho for his first film in 2000. And somebody else had already done the translation, but we sat...
So you've known him since then.
Yeah. And actually it was clear even back then that he was some kind of genius.
Really? How so? Could you explain a little bit?
Well, basically just sitting with him, and when you watch his films, there are so many interesting details in the film that you don't really necessarily catch the first time you watch the film. But if you see it a second time and a third time, you realize just to what extent everything fits together. And his films are like this very intricate machinery where you can't really take anything out, but everything relates to each other and works together. And so the structure of his films is quite fascinating. He also I think he has a natural, he knows so much about cinema.
Did you communicate with him in Korean, or he speaks English?
We spoke in Korean back then. So he does speak English quite well, I think. People got a little bit of a sense of that during the Oscar campaign. Mostly he was working with his interpreter, but he does understand quite a bit. His English is. So
you worked on his on the subtitles, right, for his first movie, which was what?
It's called Barking Dogs Never Bite, and it's kind of a black comedy set in this apartment complex. He shot it in the apartment complex where he lived after getting married, and so there's some autobiographical elements and others that are just kind of this crazy imagination.
And what were there other? Tell us a bit about the quality. I seem to remember watching Korean movies in those days with subtitles and sort of getting very distracted by the subtitles because they were in, let's say, they weren't, to be polite, they didn't help you really understand what was going on.
It's true.
Were these sort of what the modern equivalent would be, kind of a Google Translate? It was just, we've got to do this, and it wasn't really taken that seriously. Is that what it was?
Basically what it was, there was no system in place at that time. And in order to have consistently good subtitles, you obviously need good translators, but it's more than that. I think you need a good system in place to ensure that everything goes smoothly and that the translator gets what they need. And it was in the late, the end of the 1990s and early 2000s that a lot of international sales companies appeared in Korea and began exporting Korean films. Because in the 90s, Korean films didn't really go anywhere. They just were mostly screened in Korea. And so they became in charge of overseeing the subtitle process, but nobody in Korea really had a lot of experience with that. It wasn't like Japan, where films had been exported since the 1950s. So, the first challenge I think for them were finding good translators. Often the people who were judging whether a translation was good or not, they also needed to understand that the subtitle, the intricacies of subtitles to actually judge whether it was good or bad. And occasionally often it was the case that the initial translation was done by a Korean who spoke English well, but perhaps was not up to the level where they could really write in a very expressive or effective way in English. And then it would be given to a native speaker to proofread. But most proofreaders just kind of run through and fix the grammar. But you don't get good subtitles even if you fix the grammar.
In this process, are you just working with a screen, or do you see the movie as well? Are you?
Oh, you need to see the movie.
Presumably, you would have to do it well.
Yeah. Actually, some of those really bad subtitles may have been a case where somebody is working without seeing the film.
I think you see all over Korea, and I dare say in other countries where signs are translated into English, you get some. There's a whole industry of collecting these things. That's one thing, but you can imagine that's where the person doing it is not given any sense of the context where the sign or whatever it is going to appear.
Yeah. So. It's actually much easier now with digital files and everything else. Like, when you're working in the film era, then I would end up getting a VHS tape or something that I'd stick into my TV and I'd sit in front of the TV. But if something was being done in a rush, in the office or something, that, again, in a situation like that, you need a good system to ensure that that everything runs smoothly and that you get a really professional end result.
What are the? Was Parasite a particular challenge, or is it the Korean language itself is a particular challenge because the way it's structured? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Every film has its own kind of unique challenges. In the case of Parasite, I knew going in sort of what to expect because I'd worked with the director before, but a lot of the elements of the dialogue, they mean something in the context of a particular scene, but they have some deeper meaning to it as well. And so when translating, you have to kind of be aware of that. Just as a very basic example, there are certain words that are repeated throughout the film. And one character in particular who might hear something said by one character in the first half of the film and then will repeat that word in the second half of the film. And you need to make sure that you use the exact same phrasing when you translate it. There were things related to the characters and how they spoke with each other, that the director was keen to give a certain sense of like the power dynamics between a couple, and actually before I even started the translation, I got like this 3-page email from the director with all of his comments about things to keep in mind as I was translating and what were the important elements that he really wanted preserved in the translation. And then other things like, he's very sensitive to subtitles and he understands things from the perspective of an international audience as well. So with names, for example, if there's a character who appears in the first half of the film, perhaps briefly, and then does not appear again, but who is mentioned later, the audience needs to be able to remember that this name that's these characters are, are mentioning is the person that they saw in the first half of the film. And so those names are particularly crucial. A while back, one of his earlier films, Mother, there was a character called Jongpal, who was a really crucial character, but again, appears only on screen briefly. And this was his idea. He, rather than just using the word Jongpal in the subtitles, he said, let's call him Crazy JP. And
okay, it's more memorable. Yeah.
Yes, and it kind of suits his personality. But yeah, that's impossible to forget. And so later in the film, when people are talking about Crazy JP, it's not like you have to sit and say, wait a minute, who was that character? You remember it immediately. And in the case of Parasite, it was more simple, but there's one character, Minhyuk, who appears early. It's the friend of the son of the poor family. He's the one who gives him the stone and who kind of sets this whole story in motion. But we didn't call him Crazy Minhyuk or anything, but instead of Minhyuk, we just called him Min, and he's the one character who has a single syllable name in the film, which I think makes it a little bit easier for people to remember.
Hyuk is pretty...
And it is hard, yeah.
Foreign averse, yeah. Can you say a little bit about how Korean movies are distinct? I mean, we're all, if our standard is sort of the Hollywood adventure movie with its sort of formulaic approach and the hero and usually the false ending and then the happy ending. I guess in each culture, cinema is slightly different. Can you say how Korean cinema is different and what is the appeal? I mean, why is it now becoming so successful?
Yeah. I do think there's something that feels different about Korean cinema. And, over the years that I've been in Korea, I've tried to put my finger on exactly what that is. It is quite hard to put it into words. But I noticed it myself. And also running the site, I heard from a lot of people who, people from rural Australia who just by chance ended up starting watching Korean films and then express something similar. Like they feel different from Hollywood films. And so I think one thing that's I think true of most Korean films is that the emotions in the film are communicated to the audience in a very direct kind of way. And so irony isn't really a big thing in Korean cinema to the extent that it is in Hollywood cinema. And things are not usually expressed in kind of like this roundabout or indirect way. They tend to be very direct. And that can be both a strength or a weakness depending on the film, but it does create a certain sense of energy, I think, in Korean cinema as a whole, in that you're kind of hit right between the eyes with the emotions in the film. There's one critic I know who argued that in Korean films, that more time is spent to developing character than in Hollywood films. And so in the first half of the film, the plot might progress somewhat slower, but we spend more time getting to know the characters and getting to feel close to the characters. And then the plot can move later. And that does seem broadly to be true, not with every film, but with many. And I also get the sense that, Hollywood films, especially with the big budget films, like spectacle is the big thing. And you do have Korean blockbusters as well, who label themselves as blockbusters and who try to create a sense of spectacle too. But what I notice in Korean films is that you get these moments where kind of the emotion of a particular scene is meant to overwhelm you. And I think, whereas in a Hollywood film, it's the spectacle and kind of the visual spectacle, or it's kind of with star power or something, but they kind of try to create these moments that make you kind of sit back and admire the screen. And in Korean films, I think those kind of moments are less based on visuals, but more on emotion, where the emotion just kind of washes over you. I think, yeah, it's true of the really good films as the really bad films. But,
okay, well, thanks. As I say, thanks very much for coming out today. Maybe I'll just, I wonder if you could just leave us with one final thing: is next steps for you. I mean,
yes.
Are you sort of back home and doing what you were, or is there something coming up?
I mean, Parasite definitely did kind of change my life in the sense that I mean, more people know me now because of the work I did on Parasite, but beyond that, I think that there is this translation community, which I was never really a part of before. And I've always...
movie translations or...
Movie translations and translation in general.
Yeah.
I've always just kind of worked within the film community, but through Parasite, I'm becoming introduced to this broader field of translation. And so there are some projects that I'm looking to do in the future related to film translation and independent film. I would like to find a way to kind of help independent filmmakers find good translators to do their films. I'm writing a book about translation and subtitle translation and my experiences in Korea doing that. And more broadly, I am just getting the opportunity to meet with translators and learn more about that field. And so I'm at this interesting moment in my life where I'm just kind of finding these new opportunities open up.
Okay, well, we wish you the best of luck.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Okay.